I mean, I don't need an introduction. I'm happy to. So anyway, I'm just going to start talking. I will introduce myself, which means it will be really long. I'm incredible. No, my name is Dan Magaziner. I'm a professor of history at Yale, and I am a South Africanist by training. And so they would introduce and talk about my CV and blah, 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 but I'm just going to skip that and talk about this subject here. Oh, and I mean, I would say thank you to all the people who invited me, but they're not here, so, you know, forget them. So what I want to begin by talking about today is a source. And I mean, sometimes the temptation when you're a historian is you present these beautifully crafted narratives and you kind of hide the confusion that inheres in studying the past. And when I talk about a source, I want to talk about a source that I discovered in 2011 that really confused me. It was a newsletter that circulated among about a few hundred people in South Africa, most of whom, in fact, the vast majority of whom were black South Africans. And it was a newsletter that was published twice a year between 1962 and 1981. And what was striking about the newsletter was that I had been studying South African history for a while. I had published a book on student activists and politics in South Africa. And I had studied the struggle, and I thought I understood the history of apartheid. But what was so striking about this newsletter was that in its pages, these black South Africans didn't talk about politics. They didn't talk about apartheid. Instead, they talked about where do you find materials? Now, the newsletter, as will become clear, was the newsletter that existed for a school known as the Delaney Art School, which was a school run by the apartheid government for the training of arts and crafts teachers under apartheid. And in its pages, what you find are students talking about the trouble they had locating materials with which to complete their projects. For example, many students were assigned to weave with grass. But in many of these schools across South Africa, no such suitable grass existed. As one wrote, we used wool instead. They were supposed to paint, but in many of these schools there were no paints, so they used similar improvisations. We were using wet chalk and crayons instead. Whether schools were in rural areas where there was ample stone and wood, or whether they were in urban townships where there was no wood, because the school was right in the middle of a densely populated area, teachers were forced to find creative solutions to their own experiences of material want. And in their newsletter, they exchanged advice and suggestions. Quote, wood for sculpture can often be found free of charge from municipalities when trees such as jacaranda, silver oak, or syringa have to be pruned or cut down, as one teacher reported. John Hobo succeeded in getting some wood in this way in Pietermaritzburg. Vivian Bopape, for her part, went to industrial areas on the outskirts of Pretoria, where she lived. She frequented waste yards, and her quests were sometimes rewarded. She found spoiled newsprint. She found broken glass. She found torn sponges, all of which would be useful in her art lessons. Material want would impact teachers' own art practices as well. Winston Hebei was one of the most successful artists to be trained at this art school. He was a very talented painter and draftsman, but he was poor, and he had no money for paints. But he took it in stride, executing his drawings in shoe polish, nugget brand, black and browned, and he proudly exchanged a sample, or enclosed a sample, to his art teacher. These were the stories I found in this source. Stories of people finding creative solutions to predicaments of material want and poverty. People trying as best they can, turning to shoe polish to render drawings because they had no access to paint, because they had no money to buy charcoals. What is this source? What does this source mean? How do we make sense of it? Now, as I said, it's the newsletter that circulated among graduates of this art school, the Delaney Art School. But we can get a little bit more abstract about that. What we see in this newsletter is an exchange of information. This is a place where a community was brought together around similar intellectual concerns, a community that was gathered together to try and plot some way that they could deal with their particular circumstance and their need to find means to create. They used this newsletter thus to create a community, and a community that met under a shared context, or in a shared context, one of apartheid, where they were black, where they were artists, and there were all the challenges that attended to those conditions. This newsletter challenged me because I wasn't used to finding such data exchanged by black South Africans. And it offered me a challenge myself. Could I get inside it? Could I try to figure out what this community was, and then could I see how this community, which again was a few hundred people, what this community revealed about what life under apartheid was like beyond those well-told stories that most of us here know. The story of oppression and the story of the struggle to overcome centuries of white supremacy. Now, what I had discovered here in this newsletter was the story of, as I said, this institution known as the Delaney Art School, which was an art school that was run by the South African government between 1952 and 1981 for the training of African art teachers. Now, let's just make sure we all know what that means. This was a school run by the apartheid government. This was a school run by a white supremacist government to teach black South Africans art. Now, automatically, there should be some questions that raises, like, okay, why did the apartheid government have an art school? Being a very obvious one, and it's one I'll come and revisit in a little bit. But also, if we want to think more about that, all of the teachers who wrote in those newsletters, all of those people who shared ideas in the context of the Delaney Art School were thus not only artists and not only teachers, but they were participants in the apartheid projects. These were black South Africans who worked for the apartheid government and who eagerly exchanged ideas about how they could do their jobs better. Okay? So these are challenging historical subjects. These aren't the characters that we're used to studying. These teachers, these artists, were part of the government system of Bantu education. And those of you who know anything about South Africa have probably heard of Bantu education, because Bantu education, as it was often and correctly maligned, was education for slavery. It was a second-rate, well, actually that's giving it a bit too much credit, it was like a 22nd-rate education system that the white South African government enacted after the advent of Afrikaner nationalist rule in 1948 with the goal of perpetuating white supremacy in South Africa. Blacks would only be able to do some jobs and no more than that. The masses, the vast majority of the black South African population, would be kept perpetually subservient to the white South Africans, because the school system would ensure that their political position would be repeated generation for generation. These were people who worked in that context. These were people who worked and tried to do their jobs better within the system of Bantu education. But what else were they? They were black South African teachers. And what did it mean for them? It meant that first going for 1 year, or for 2 years, and then it was reduced to 1 year, they left their homes from across South Africa. Nearly 1,000 black South Africans left their homes from all these various places in the country to travel to essentially the middle of nowhere. This just kind of gets closer and closer. This is South Africa. This is the southeastern coast of South Africa, what was then the Natal province. 50 kilometers outside of Pietermaritzburg, you have a small farming community called Richmond. 3 kilometers outside of Richmond, you have an old Methodist mission station, one of South Africa's oldest mission stations that had been established in the 1840s, which became the center of this art school in the 1950s. The Delaney mission and the art school took the name of the mission as its name, and it became the Delaney Art School. And they traveled from across South Africa to come to this school to study those elements of the Bantu education syllabus that the government expected black art teachers to know and to teach. To study beadwork, to study bone work, bone carving, to study wood carving, grass weaving, but also to study painting, to study sculpting in clay and other methods. They came there to work on their own art practice. They came to learn how to teach, to repeat what they had learned, and seed it within the apartheid South African school system. What else did they do? They left home. They left their families. Most of them were already teachers. Most of them were already employed by Bantu Education. And for many, it offered a respite to come to Delaney, which, although in the middle of nowhere, is a strikingly beautiful place. An old mission station set up high on a hill in what was then a quiet agricultural community. To spend time creating, to spend time dialoguing with objects, with material objects, to create things of their own invention. To take time off from the pressures of teaching, to be a student once more, to come and to learn. And all you had to do to get that opportunity was to sign a contract that you would participate in Bantu Education, that you would teach for as long as you spent at Delaney in order to repay the terms of your scholarship, of your bursary. Most did it for at least that year. Many did it for many years longer, continuing to work for the system until Bantu Education fell apart in the 1980s. This for them was not what we think it ought to have been, that they were collaborators, that they were elements of this system of white supremacy. Because instead, for many of them, it was worth it in their own terms. Teaching art in Bantu Education schools, Elijah Zwane wrote in the early 1960s, was an incredible experience. Quote, "Wishing to see what I had in my class, I introduced modeling in clay and picture painting, and the work of the pupils struck me with wonder. It was marvelous to see what talents remained buried in the nerves of an African child." A decade later, Mercy Gu, working in a totally different part of the country, Elijah Zwane worked in a rural area. She worked in the center of Soweto, the most urbanized part of the country, but she reported similar findings. Quote, "My students' imagination is fairly wide when it comes to clay or paper mache. They are not at all inhibited. Listening to them chatter while they worked, she was transported back to her time at art school, her time at Delaney, to the joy that she had experienced there, the freedom that resounded, quote, in the sound of the hammer and the chisel as people carved in the free and open air." My talk today draws on a book that I've recently published about this art school, because what I want to do with this study, what I want to do with that book and with this talk, is use the existence of this institution, as I said at the outset, to challenge my own preconceptions of what South Africa can be, and also to challenge the scholarship on South Africa, to explore and expose the ways in which our understanding of what went on in 20th century South Africa is still limited in all sorts of ways. And I want to use this microhistory, because it is that, it's a microhistory. It's not demographically significant for the whole of the country. But to see the ways in which this microhistory opens up possibilities of understanding different ways in which people could be black and could be South African under apartheid, and to explore the implications of that. The story of this data, as I said at the beginning, challenged me, and I want to use it to challenge us and to challenge the discipline in which I operate. I want to use the ideas that circulated at Delaney, and especially the ways in which the ideas help to constitute historical subjects to ask new questions about this past. And along the way, I also want to throw some shade at art history, because art history is a discipline in South Africa, at least, that is very limited. And so I'm now going to turn and critique art history for a little while, with all apologies to any art historians in the audience. Now, why do I want to throw some shade at art history? If you Google South African black art history, don't do it because I'm not sure that's true, I just said it, all right? If you were to Google it and it were to be true, and I don't know if it is, but I assume it probably is, what you would find are a lot of images like this. One of the best known parts and aspects of the South African struggle against white supremacy, especially from the 1970s on, has been the participation of people who we would call artists, but who self-defined as cultural workers in that struggle. The African National Congress, the largest anti-apartheid organization, considered among its most important missions that it was going to redefine the terms by which South Africans created. And so they had this idea, they had an arts and culture wing who was in charge of producing work musical work, theatrical work, or visual culture, other such things, all of which would feed into the overall mission of bringing down the edifice of white supremacy. Thus was this sort of work done. Incredibly talented artists, people like Tommy and Yele, who went into exile in Botswana in the early 1980s and helped to produce silkscreen posters, beautiful pieces of art that were supposed to contribute to the ideological struggle against white supremacy. And it was really important that he did so. So much so that in 1985, the South African government sent a death squad across the border and assassinated him. Art was part of the struggle. This was clear. One of the most common ways, then, that we narrate the Black South African creative experience, not just the Black South African life experience in 20th century South Africa, is by focusing on how art is inextricable from politics, which means that art in South Africa isn't often about beauty. It's more often about brutality. It's more often about the reality that this is an oppressive state and that people must struggle against it. The artworks manifest this. These are works that reveal the inhumanity that has lived within this country and against which people are struggling. So that's what most of the art history on Black South Africans is about. But the problem is, those aren't the only things that Black South Africans created, and they weren't the only things that they talked about. There has been a history of self-consciously described artists from among the Black South African population going back to the years around World War I, which is to say, a very long time. And for many of those artists, political concerns were just one among a whole host of concerns that animated their creative beings. Gerard Sokoto, and those of you who I saw in a class earlier today heard me talk a bit about Sokoto. Sokoto earns a reputation in the interwar period when he begins to paint, not because he's commenting on politics, but because he's painting what he sees. He's painting the new urban forms that exist in South African cities, the ways in which black people are incorporated into those communities. He's painting the laughter, he's painting some of the sadness and pathos. Sometimes, yes, he does paint the politics. He does paint situations like this that are easily digestible and understandable to be a commentary on South African political reality. But that's not the whole of who he was. And Sokoto is only one among so many examples. There were Black South African landscape painters. John Kwenikanife Mole lived in Johannesburg, where he taught piano during the week. He loved jazz and some classical composition. And then on the weekends, he would go for walks in the hills just north of Johannesburg, and he would sketch, and he would come back and he would paint landscapes. I challenge you, there's a politics in painting landscapes, don't get me wrong, but this is not the struggle. This is something else. When I was beginning to think about what I wanted to do as a historian, and I began to think about my interest in art, I was very drawn to these sorts of artists whose commentary was a little bit harder to discern than those who had been overdetermined because of the narrative of the inextricability of politics and art. And one among those I became very interested in was a guy named Dan Raghuwate. And it's Dan Raghuwate that ultimately led me to the existence of the Delaney Art School. Now, I'm going to hazard a guess. I'm assuming that those of you I don't already know or haven't already read my work had never heard of this school before. Is there anyone in this room who had ever heard of this place before? Okay. I will say I've asked that question to many audiences. Once, someone said yes, and she was a liar. And I caught her in the lie. And it was humiliating for her and amazing for me, but also kind of humiliating for me because I was so excited to catch her in her lie that I had to face all these realities about myself that made me uncomfortable. Anyway, I had never heard of this school. I was exploring Black South African art. I was exploring its multiple manifestations. I had never heard of this school. There was an artist who emerged in the 1960s and 1970s named Dan Raghuwate. And Dan Raghuwate was emerging at the same time as Tommy and Yele, the guy whose silk screen I showed you earlier and who subsequently is assassinated by the South African Defense Forces in 1985. These guys were contemporaries. But Raghuwate was on some other levels. Raghuwate was very interested in the 1960s and 1970s in recovering forms of African spirituality through visual art in a way that he saw had been overcome by Christianity over the preceding decades. And Rahawate was a really interesting guy, and he found a lot of patrons who bought his work, and one of those people decided to write a biography of him. I was getting very frustrated. I wanted to look at the multiple ways in which black South Africans created, but I had a problem which there were very few documents. And so I learned there was a biography of Dan Rahawate, and I got super excited, and I read the biography, and in it, it said a lot of the knowledge this author had of him was based on letters that he sent to someone named L. Pearson at a place I'd never heard of, in Delaney, outside of Richmond in Natal. And I thought, wow, I don't know who that is, but I like letters. I'm a historian. I'm like, letters are like my thing. I get into them. So I was going to go find these letters. And so I went and I found the letters and I put down this file on the archive in Durban. It was about this big. It was thousands of letters that he'd sent to this woman, L. Pearson. And I read some of them and I thought, wow, I really have no idea what this is. This is quite a source. And I closed it and then I kind of sat there and the archivist said, you know, we have more. And I said, oh, okay. And she showed me in the back room of the archive a file cabinet that had been locked since 1985. It said, do not open until the year 2000. And 11 years had passed and no one had come knocking, so they had not opened it. And what it discovered was that L. Pearson was this woman on the left, Lorna Pearson, who had been Rahawate's art teacher. She had been the teacher, the head art teacher, organizer, and principal of the Delaney Art School between 1963 and 1981. She was its archivist. She had inherited the archive when the school closed down in 1981. She had burned some of it, but then someone had convinced her to deposit it in this archive in Durban, where it sat until I discovered it or rediscovered it and opened it in 2011. And what was it? It was the complete archive of the apartheid government's art school. It was not just Rahawate's file, but hundreds of similar files. And not just those correspondence files, but also student records, their report cards, examples of their work, all of the telegrams that they exchanged as they were trying to travel to Delaney, issues they had with their luggage, complaints they received, police reports, all sorts of things, as well as that newsletter with which I began. That newsletter published biannually between 1962 and 1981, detailing what went on at the school. It allowed me new insights. Suddenly, instead of no documents, I had a wealth of documents. And I could use them to pursue that question of what did it mean to create under apartheid? What were the multiple ways in which black South Africans lived creatively? Yes, there was the struggle, and that was vital and critical, and we need to understand it. But what else was there? So let's kind of move to that. And by answering the first question that may have occurred to you, which is why did the South African government have an art school? I wrote like way too many pages to answer this question. I'm going to give you the very short version, which I know you will all feel is way too long anyway, but I'm still going to do it. Okay, it has to do a lot with this guy right here. That guy's named Charles Loram. Charles Loram was the inspector of native education in Natal, one of the South Africa's 4 provinces, during the years bracketing World War I. Loram had studied in the United States. He had a PhD where he studied with, among others, John Dewey at Teachers College, and he wrote as his thesis a book called The Education of the South African Native. Notably, he had not done his field work for this book, even though he was South African. He had not done his field work for this book in South Africa. He'd done this field work instead in the American South, at field sites such as Tuskegee and Hampton College and other such places, where he was studying the ways in which African Americans had been educated after emancipation, from the middle of the 19th century on. He was very interested in the ways in which the African American precedent might in some way help the predicament in which South Africa was finding themselves. South Africa had become one country in 1910 when the Union of South Africa affected the union among formerly Afrikaans-ruled and British colonial-ruled provinces. It was a settler colony. There was this powerful white minority that had all political and economic power. But it was not a settler colony like the United States or Canada or Australia because they hadn't managed to kill off all of the local peoples. Instead, they had this problem. There was a massive majority population that was African and that was only, as they saw it, imperfectly integrated into the social and economic structures of South Africa. As Loram saw it, the ways in which he would figure out the best way to make this country move forward was through education. And he studied the example of the segregated education system in the US South, believing that it would in some way help to set a precedent for South Africa. And the conclusion that he came to is that education for black South Africans could not be like education for white South Africans, because education for black South Africans was never going to train you to be a lawyer or a doctor or a teacher or a university professor or something of that sort. Instead, it had to teach you a craft, what he called an industry. You needed to get some sort of practical, technical training, and that was going to be the be-all and end-all of black South African education. This was not just a South African phenomenon. This is something that occurred across colonial Africa during this time period, and Loram was hugely influential, especially in the Anglophone colonies, in articulating this policy. And what Loram believed then was that all schools that received any government money, first in Natal, then elsewhere in the Union of South Africa, needed to mandate that the black students work with their hands while in school, what was known as handwork or industrial education. This idea was, again, that they'd learn some useful technical skills, they could turn these into jobs, they wouldn't be poor, they could contribute in some small way to the overall economic health of South Africa. The problem, so this is Loram, okay? At the same time that Loram is doing this, he's not the only person internationally who's thinking a lot about the ways, about what people are supposed to do in school and the ways in which students in particular should be working with their hands in school. I mentioned John Dewey earlier, who had been one of Loram's mentors at Teacher College. Dewey had already been very famous in the United States for decades because he advocated this idea of learning through doing. That's a kind of cliche associated with him. That education could not just be an intellectual exercise, it also had to be a tactile exercise. You needed to touch things. You needed to make things. Your whole person needed to be animated within the school context. Dewey believed that this was essential to the development of well-rounded human beings, and he was not alone in thinking so. There were many people, especially in progressive quarters in the United States and in Europe in the years around World War I, who saw that one of the great challenges facing human society was that now that society was becoming industrialized, now that more and more people were moving into cities, they were losing touch with their rural background. Human beings weren't made to sit still, these theorists argued. Instead, human beings had always been at action. They had been herding, they had been weeding, they had been farming. I don't herd or weed or farms, that's why it sounds weird when I say those things. They'd been doing things out in the world. And schools had to be the place where that essential human process of doing things was continued. This could be through cooking classes, this could be especially through art classes. Many people begin to believe that art is an essential part of the school system, beginning at the earliest age. That kids can't just be taught to read and to write and to do arithmetic. They need to be given a space to create. These theorists begin to argue that the reason World War I had happened among the purportedly most civilized societies in the world was because they had lost touch with their essential humanistic roots, because they had become urbanized, industrialized, complacent, fat, and lazy. And they needed to go and make things again. Making things would make people better. It would instill social harmony. Now, among the many advocates for this was a guy named Arthur Lismer, who worked at the Toronto Art Gallery and became a very well-known specialist in the 1920s on the importance of childhood art education. He and Dewey and others were invited to South Africa in 1934, and they delivered this idea that art needed to happen in South African schools. There was a big international meeting known as the New Education Fellowship. Thousands of people came from all over the world to spend a month in Cape Town and a month in Johannesburg and to make suggestions about the South African school system. People like Lismer and Dewey, their suggestion was clear. You need to do art in schools. Now, let's go back to Loram for a second. Loram's vision was Africans would get jobs if they go and learn blacksmithing and gardening and carpentry in schools. What Loram was perhaps too naive to recognize was that in South Africa, there weren't just white clerks, lawyers, and translators, but South Africa also had a white artisanal class that really weren't that excited about the government training Africans to take their jobs. There had been tremendous pushback in the 1920s against these initiatives like Loram to instill industrial education. Handwork, by the end of the 1920s, falls out of fashion. This is increased during the Great Depression as white South Africans are largely become unemployed and need to find jobs working at the lower end of the economic spectrum. Handwork falls out of fashion, but this period mandated that all African students work with their hands stays on the curriculum. It's transformed from handwork to what is known as craftwork. And the idea given for craftwork is this idea that African schools are not just going to be places where Africans learn things, but they're also going to be places where Africans learn how to be African. Now let me pause on that for a second because it's somewhat counterintuitive. Schools are a white Western eruption in Black South African society. Yet here was the government saying that by sending kids to schools, black kids will learn how to remain African. The South African version of this fear about what was happening to society that was manifest in the progressive ideas of art education in Europe and in the United States, the South African version of this held that the great challenge facing South Africa was not just unemployment, but essentially this specter known as detribalization. This idea that the African people, as they are brought into the industrial economy, as they are moved into cities, as they come to participate in this increasingly cosmopolitan society that is South Africa, they're losing touch with their roots. They're losing touch with what makes them distinct people. And this is a real challenge for the segregationists who make South African social policy. Because if Africans forget that they're African, they might get crazy ideas, including that they should have the right to vote and to live wherever they want, and to participate as full members in South African society. So the government's solution is we need to find a way to remind these people that they're African. So the way we're going to do this, among others, is we're going to send them to schools and we're going to say, you are black, therefore you sit down on the ground for an hour a day and you weave grass, because that's what Africans do. You produce crafts that are recognizably African because that's what you're supposed to do, and we will buy them and we will hold you up as an exemplar of your race or your tribe. It went all the way. All right, gonna have to do the rest, no more water. And so this is the system that we're going to create. It's going to help contribute to this ideal we have of creating a racial stratification in South Africa. So you have these three strands. Lorem creates a space in the syllabus. Work with your hands for a period per day. The progressives say art education is essential to the creation of whole, humane human beings. And the segregationists say, and it's also going to be able to be how we create this idea, or how we buttress the concept of racial difference in South Africa. One person comes to capture all of these trends, who's a man named Jack Krauser. Krauser is an art historian. He attends the New Education Fellowship meeting in 1934. He's totally in love with Arthur Lismer. He invites Arthur Lismer back to come to South Africa to do a grand tour around the country and to offer suggestions not only about how best to create art in schools, but what art is the best to make sure that Africans remain African by doing art in schools. Lismer comes, he offers his suggestions. Krauser posits this idea. His theory is that African society, before the advent of colonialism, had been harmonious. It had been an integrated place where all the pieces fit together. I like this drawing he did of a northern Sotho village, because this is not what they look like. But this is his idealized vision of what they should look like. They're utterly harmonious, beautiful geometric shapes. Everything fits perfectly, as if in a puzzle. This is not what they looked like in his time. Northern Sotho people had suffered tremendous economic loss and hardship over centuries of colonial incursion into their territory. Their villages did not look like this. They did not build just out of these materials. They used plastic and metal and all the other things that were part of the built culture, or the built environment in South Africa. But Krauser believed that this is what it could be. This is what it had been, and it's what it could be. And art in schools was going to be how you work your way back to it. By making little kids come and create grass brooms in their classrooms, even as they used brooms that they bought from stores. By making little kids bead. By making little kids create baskets out of grass, even though they used plastic buckets in their day-to-day lives. By doing these things, an essential, harmonious African character would be preserved and passed on through education. This would make African society better, which would make South Africa better. In 1948, the Afrikaner National Party wins an election and establishes the government of South Africa and announces the new policy of apartheid. Among the first things that it does is it sets a 2-year commission to go and study the various forms of African education that had existed under British colonial rule in the Union of South Africa, and to make recommendations about what to do. This is the commission that creates the system of Bantu education that is going to be this education for slavery to perpetuate the white supremacy within South African society. The commission is scathing about most elements of the previous education system, but they love the art element. They love the idea that art can be the way that we preserve racial difference, because that's what apartheid is all about. Apartheid is about preserving racial difference. Art is going to be one of the most critical ways in which we do it. So they announced that not only are they going to keep it, they're going to expand it. They're going to take over the entire school system for Bantu education. All education will come under government control, and all of the schools, including those that had never had art before, are going to now have art. And they put Jack Krauser in charge of it. Krauser is from Natal. He searches around for a place where he can help institutionalize this by training art teachers to be able to participate in this system. He happens upon the old mission station of Delaney, outside of Richmond, in the middle of nowhere, 50 kilometers from the provincial capital of Pietermaritzburg. He announces in 1951 that he's opening an art school for the training of African art teachers, where Africans interested in art can come and study first for 2 and then for 1 years to help be part of this system. If my water bottle was still here, this is when I drink, but instead, I'm just going to power through. All right, so finally we get to this question of what was in Delaney? What was this school? What was it? Oh, we've answered why it existed, but now we have to say, what was it doing? What function did it have in people's lives? Now here I want to transition, because anyone who knows about history knows that you have ideas, you have theories, but then when they meet the reality of human existence, the messiness of quotidian life, that theory basically falls apart. So what happens once the school's enacted? One of the first things that the students begin to come, and they begin to explore for themselves the question of what it means to be a black South African participating in the Bantu education system who's also interested in creating. And there's a fundamental question that they have to answer there, which, is that for me? Oh my God.
Somebody did this once for me, sir.
Oh my God, that is, I'm gonna definitely spill it on myself, but thank you. Oh, thank you very much. So the first thing they have to answer is, what kind of school is this? Is it a government school, or is it an art school? What exactly is it that they're trying to do? They do the best that they can to transform this old, bleak mission station. And I need to underline that when the South African government takes over education, what they do is they take pre-existing mission schools and they empty them of their missionary content, but they use all the buildings that the missionaries had built. So if the missionaries had taught a more liberal form of education in Delaney, they're now all kicked out. Government bureaucrats and teachers come in, but the buildings stay the same. So what does that mean? That means that this is a poor mission station. The conditions are pretty terrible. It's not a particularly attractive place other than the physical environment. So the students begin to beautify it. And this is just giving you an example of that. But in their beautification, we can see what becomes the dominant theme of the Delaney Art School, which Pearson captures in the early 1960s with this adage that she always said, we have to make something from nothing. Don't have, the government says, here, we're going to have an art program. They don't give very much money for it. So instead, what happens in Delaney is not fine art, it's not craft work, it's not ethnic art, it's essentially scrounged art. People doing what they can to create under the conditions that were not of their choosing. This image here is of the entranceway to the girls' hostel outside of Delaney. This is a close-up of one of the mosaics here. This mosaic was not made from people going out and buying tiles, searching out good material. This was made from garbage. Going out and seeing if someone dropped a glass at dinner, you would pick up the glass and find the pieces that were big enough that you could use. If someone broke a plate, you would pick up the pieces that were big enough for you to use. You would find somewhere where you could get some old stucco from construction sites, and you would use it to create these objects of creation and whimsy. What you see then in Delaney is not art necessarily, but it's South African art. It's an art that is born out of the conditions in which these people found themselves. The best example of this, and these murals were made very cheaply, they're mostly egg tempera mixed with beeswax, and many of them are still there at the site because it's the material is so durable, except in some areas where bees get into it and then it's less durable. But that it's still, you can see many of these murals. And the most relevant example of this, or revealing example of this, is what Delaney does with wood. Now, as I said, Delaney is not very well known in South Africa, but where it is known at all is in Pietermaritzburg, which is, as I said, the provincial capital of the Natal province. Because between 1966 and 1978, every year, Delaney would have a show in Pietermaritzburg where people would buy their products. And a certain class of white Maritzburger usually has tons of Delaney's art that they bought. And what they buy more than anything else is wood sculpture. And they buy wood sculpture for a number of reasons. The most important of them is that it fits into their notions of what African art is supposed to be. Because where African art was known in the wider world during the 1960s, what was known especially was the art that comes out of Equatorial and West Africa, which is predominantly wood carving. It so happens that in South Africa there are very few, only in the very northern part of the country, are there any indigenous carving traditions. But Delaney produces a lot of wood art, which makes it read as ethnic in certain ways, as appropriately African. And so these white Maritzburgers love it and they buy it in spades. Why did Delaney produce so much wood art? This mural tells you why. They didn't have paint. They didn't have much other material. But they were right next door to a timber farm. And they were friends with the timber farmer. And the timber farmer, when they had a piece that was not suitable for either being used in construction or being turned into paper, a particularly ugly and gnarled piece, they would let the students pick those odds and ends out and let them use it in their art practice. So Delaney becomes associated with wood sculpture not because they're black, not because that's what African art is, but because that was what they had. They had wood. So they did the best they could to create from that wood. And they created some tremendous things. This crocodile, for example, is nearly 1 meter long, carved out of a single piece of wood. One student worked on it for nearly a year to create this composition, which now, I should say, lives in the basement of the Tatham Art Gallery in Pietermaritzburg in a lightless room. And this just to give you a sense of what it looked like. This is a picture of the year-end exhibit. And you can see all the wood sculptures and all the white people drawn to them like moths to a flame, trying to find something that could be appropriate, that they could collect for their collections of African art. And I've been to these people's houses. They have dozens and dozens of pieces of this wood sculpture. But if you look in the outskirts here, wood sculpture was only some of the work that they did. There are their paintings, their drawings, their creations out of string, burnt wood carvings, all sorts of different objects with which they were experimenting but didn't sell because the wood was what really drove the market. They were trying to create with what was possible. Part of the Delaney curriculum was they studied art history. Art history, you spent your morning studying art history. We begin with, locally, with sand, rock, cave paintings, what was then known as Bushman art in South Africa. Then you would proceed into the ancient world. You would get into medieval art, Christian art, the Renaissance, onward and so forth until you ended usually with Picasso at the end of the year. They loved Rodin, but they couldn't afford bronze. So they created their own bronze. What is it? It's paper mache. Paper mache that they painted gold with the kind of paints that kids would use. And then they did a layer of black, frequently shoe polish, over that gold. Then they rubbed away some of the black to approximate maybe what bronze looks like when it's finished. They were trying to make something from the nothing that they had. My favorite example of this is a kiln that was on campus. One thing that they had in abundance other than wood was clay. The riverine soils on either side of the small streams that flowed around the Delaney mission had a lot of clay that were in the riverbanks. And clay was free. All it cost was labor. You could go, you could dig it, you could spend time preparing it, you could treat it. This was a painstaking process. But if you did it, you would be rewarded with this object that you could shape, with which that you could create, that wouldn't be limited like wood was by the form of the log that you had been given. They loved clay, but clay sometimes took months to produce. This then was part of the dialogue of creating. At this exact same moment, there were students at the Michaelis School of Fine Arts at the University of Cape Town who would go to the art studio and there would just be clay. That was not these artists' experience. Instead, they had to dig clay. They had to carry it up to the hill. They had to cover it in water and give it time for the clay particles to settle. They had to seethe it so they could get all of the excess and dirt out of it. Then they had to let it dry. If it rained, they'd start all over. If it didn't rain, they would be able to then wet it again, process it another time, and then they had no kiln. So once you'd created, they had a hole that they dug in the ground that they lined with bricks scrounged from construction sites. They took some of that donated wood and they built a fire that had to be very carefully maintained. Too cool, it would not fire the clay objects. Too hot, those objects would be destroyed. One of the most recurring themes in the Delaney correspondence files is Pearson and other teachers writing to Pretoria, to the Department of Bantu Education, saying, look, people, we need an electric kiln. We have electricity. Such things exist in South Africa. The white schools have them. We need an electric kiln because our people are working so hard, and then they have to make a fire and sit there and to maintain it while their objects cook, as it were. And for decades, they write, please send a kiln. And finally, in 1972, the government relents and sends an electric kiln. They ship it to Delaney, and they never open it, and they never use it. Because they realize something. What good is an electric kiln at Delaney? Because they're there to train art teachers. And when those art teachers leave Delaney, they're not going to have access to an electric kiln. They're going to a Bantu education school. That's not going to be in the realm of the possible. So instead, they need to figure out, they need to do this. Because you need to learn the work that is involved, because then they can teach what they have learned to their students. They can give their students the means to create. Now, what I want to emphasize here is that and there's so many other examples. My other favorite example of making something for nothing, and I will stop talking the something for nothing bit of this with this last one, is there was an assignment when they went home for winter holidays. They all had to create one object with something they found around their houses. Now, for people from Johannesburg, if you had a bit of money, you could go to an art store and you could buy some paints. And you'd be like, look, I found some tubes of oil paint and I've created a painting. You could do that. But for people especially who were poor and in rural areas, they couldn't do that. And my favorite example was a student from a very rural area in the Eastern Cape who wanted to go and do a drawing in green when she went back to her rural village. But she had no green. What did she have? She had sheep. What color is sheep feces? Sheep feces is green. So she discovered that if you mix sheep feces with egg, you can create a paste that you can paint. Suddenly she had green. She could do a landscape. She could portray the green field that she saw around her. Over time, she admitted the green fields would turn a little bit brown as the feces continued its process. But for her, it was that opportunity. This was green. She can make that. That is such a revealing example to me, because this was apartheid's art school. This was creating under the sign of the possible in apartheid South Africa. But for these students, for these creators, for these teachers, that was no excuse. The most remarkable thing that I found in the Delaney archive was not just that resourcefulness, but the ways in which Black South Africans come to understand themselves as creative beings because of that resourcefulness. The ways in which they are able to dialogue with the limitations of their material circumstance to create these objects that show their worlds. These objects that allow them to speak in this material form. To be an art student then, to arrive at Delaney Hill, to try and create, was to negotiate with the apartheid government. It was to be subject to its edicts. It was to be employed by its white supremacist regime. And in exchange, you got bad food, you got poor living conditions, but you got the opportunity to say something. Quote, "This art course interested me to such an extent that when I had a chisel and a mallet or a brush and a paint in hand, I felt myself an earthly imitative god." This is Ernest Majova speaking in 1964. "Whether I can be deprived of all other earthly possessions or be led to enjoy solitary life, having a chisel and a mallet or a brush and a paint in hand, I have the whole world in my pocket." Sentiments such as these from a black South African employee of the apartheid government. George Kulati described art as music. Art was the music of creating, the most pleasant endeavor in which human beings could participate. Creating, quote, takes loads that overcrowd my feelings, takes off loads that overcrowd my feelings. And seeing these loads in the form of art gives such content to my inner self that I usually feel that I could go days without food, but instead just stand and stare at my accomplishments. Art school, he reflected, was about being alive in South Africa in the middle of the 20th century and seizing the opportunity to say something. Upon leaving in Delaney, quote, "You take the world as your own invention." Now, of course, that wasn't true. He had not invented this world. He was subject to a world in which he was a permanently second-class, if that, citizen. He was always, or at least as the system that employed him aspired to do, to be subject to this system of white supremacy. But the art school opened a venue for him where by dialoguing with the possible, by creating along the sign of the possible, he could take the world as his own invention, which I think is a very powerful statement. What I want to understand then about Delaney was how it reveals something that a lesson that art yields for social history. Now, before the advent of computers, one of the most striking things about art, and why art is such an interesting historical subject, is there's a rule to create in visual arts. You cannot create with that which you do not have. You can't paint if you don't have paints. If you don't have green, there will be no green. You cannot carve wood if you have no wood. This is a fact. This is a truth of art creation. The lesson that Delaney teaches, I think, is similar for social history, because it reveals that the most common human experience is not what we tend to valorize and focus on in our history courses, which are the heroes, those who envision a world different than that in which they find themselves. The most common social experience are people doing the best they can with what they have. You cannot create with that which you do not have. This is true in art, and it's true in life. One of the lessons of Delaney, then, is these guys, I've learned to see them not as hopelessly compromised, not as collaborators, not as participants in the edifice of white supremacy, not as of people of false consciousness, but instead they were creators. They were doing what they could with what they had, and it was a valued and valuable experience. One of my favorite examples is this guy, Jesse Mutigi. Jesse Mutigi was a student in Delaney in 1960, and he left to go home for the winter holidays in June of, 1970. And he left to go home for the winter holidays in June of 1970, and he was very quickly back with his family and overwhelmed with all sorts of responsibilities. But he took the time to write a letter to his art teacher to describe how he himself had changed over the preceding 6 months. Quote, "The arts and crafts course has really changed my way of life. I see things in a different way," he wrote. "Having traveled to art school and back, I see differently. I set my eyes in a new way. I observe paintings, drawings, design, light, form." He knew then that he was seeing the world differently. And he also knew that others were seeing that transformation in him. The man he knew himself to be, Jesse Mutigi, was transformed. He was, quote, "proud, because my friends seemed to see something new in me." He knew it. His friends knew it, and he reported they are so jealous that they promised to apply for next year. This is beautiful stuff. This is beauty. This is romance. But we also need to temper it, because it still is apartheid. And it's romance under the sign of the possible which apartheid provided. What these people could have done had they been born in a different time and a different place is very hard to comprehend, because instead they were born in South Africa. Silverman Jaha was a student in Delaney in 1964. He was a very talented draftsman and artist. He was a very highly recommended student. He did excellently well on campus. And among the things he did was he created this massive sculpture out of cement waste that he created. First, he created a frame out of wire that he found at construction sites. He covered it in cement that he was able to scrounge. He scored it in all these ways, and then he stuffed it with garbage to give it body, to make sure that it would still stand. And it does still stand today. Silverman Jaha finished in 1964. He went back to the Eastern Cape where he was from. He taught art. He sent some of his students to go and study it in Delaney. He was promoted. He became a more and more successful African art teacher in Bantu education. And then in 1980, he was stoned to death by his students as he tried to stop them from burning their school during a protest against the system of Bantu education. He was an artist, but the world in which he was an artist was not the world of his own creation. He was creating in the world that was. The reality of in Delaney is that even as they created new selves, even as they created new forms of beauty, they did so in a world in which apartheid provided the broader context. And when they left in Delaney, so transformed, they had to go out into the world of apartheid to try to make real what they had learned, to offer their students that same experience that they themselves had gone through while on campus. And it was not easy, because they went out into Bantu education, which meant frequently schools of hundreds of students with maybe a dozen teachers, schools that received no funding for art and certainly did not have electric kilns, schools where art was still very imperfectly understood, and a society in which being a teacher in Bantu education, even though there were a lot of them, there were a lot of people who thought that wasn't the best way that you could live your life. It was hard, sometimes it was violent, but they still managed to do remarkable things. These are students of a man named Godfrey Mpulu, who taught in Guguletu outside of Cape Town in the 1970s. Godfrey Mpulu's schools had no roofs. They were just walls put out on the open veld outside of Cape Town in the area known as the Cape Flats. Yet he managed to create these papier-mâché masks and to put on plays with his students, to offer them these opportunities. When I began to do this research, I met Lorna Pearson, the principal who had been so instrumental in the creating of the school. And we spent a lot of time together before she passed away in 2015. And I asked her what she thought was the high point of her career. And she thought about it for a moment, and then she came out and she brought out this pig that she had in her possession. This pig had been sent to her by a teacher in the northern part of South Africa, and it had been produced by one of his students, someone who was 10 or 11 years old, so she remembers. And this pig was, she said, the zenith of her career. And I asked her, why was this pig the zenith of her career? And what it was she said, well, technically it's wonderful. I mean, I couldn't do that. I don't know if you guys could do that. Technically it's wonderful. It's just dried grass over a wire frame. But also what she saw in it was the uniqueness of it. There was never any other pig like this pig. And in that uniqueness, she could see that idea of what Dewey and Lismer had talked about, that art made people into richer human beings, not in terms of economic wealth, but richer humans in terms of their own being in the world. And she could see in her mind's eye that student, a young African student, working for a couple hours here and there, sitting outside of a poorly funded school in apartheid South Africa, in conversation with himself. And she thought it was a him, so that's why I say himself. In conversation with himself, to create this object, to author this object, which becomes a way to author his own existence in the world. For her, that was the zenith of her career. But she couldn't escape the fact that the career was captured within apartheid. And the Delaney system gradually falls because embedded within Bantu education, and it cannot survive the end of the Bantu education system. As most of you probably know, in 1976, there's a series of student protests that break out across South Africa, beginning in Soweto on June 16, 1976, and then spreading across the rest of the country. Those protests against Bantu education explicitly become the first stage in what becomes a broad uprising across South African cities that doesn't really relent until the end of apartheid in 1994. The death of Silverman Jaha is part of that process. This moment is typically narrated as a heroic turning point in South Africa. This is the beginning of the end. For Delaney's students, they experienced it as the beginning of a different sort of end. Mercy Gu, who I quoted earlier, who talked about how her students in Soweto reminded her of her own time at Delaney and how much joy she got out of that. Mercy Gu was a teacher at a higher primary school in Orlando West. That, for those of you who know South African history and Johannesburg geography, that's where the Soweto uprising began. That's where the first students were shot. Those were her students. She experienced it not just as a tragedy on that level, but also a tragedy because she had worked for a decade to instill the values of art, creativity, and humanism in her school. And now, with the protests, that was no longer possible. She wrote a letter saying she missed her students. She missed their chatter, which she described as her song, and she wished everything would come to normal. That's a counter-revolutionary sentiment in one reading of it. But it's also a powerful statement of her own identity and what she had hoped to accomplish during her own life. The school gradually in Delaney begins to fade as Bantu education fades. And you see the reality that it was this romance only made possible by apartheid. People suffer because of it. Because even as they learn to be artists and express themselves, the world is not of their own invention as much as they would like it to be. The man who carved this, Samson Machlobo, tried over and over again to move to Johannesburg. He really wanted to be an artist. He wanted to wear a beret. He wanted to hang out in art studios, but he had a problem. He was only allowed to live in Everton, which is an area outside of Johannesburg that had no art scene. So he would have to go to the Department of Influx Control to get his passbook, that document that all black South Africans had to carry, to get on his passbook permission to move to Johannesburg so that he could go and participate in the art scene, and they refused it again and again and again. He tried for years. He tried to get his own solo show. He had no material, and eventually he gave up and he killed himself. Jesse Mutigi, this man who saw himself differently, wanted to take that same sense of possibility and bring it to Vendeland, where he was from, in the northern part of South Africa, by applying for a position to be the organizer of arts and crafts in that region. He was passed over, though, because Vendeland, like all those other areas in the rural parts of South Africa, was incredibly corrupt, was under a system of incredibly corrupt government. Someone else got the position instead who knew nothing about art, but who happened to be an important Venda leader's brother-in-law. Jesse Mutigi quit art very soon thereafter and tried to eke out a living selling fruits and vegetables in the regional capital. You couldn't escape apartheid. You couldn't escape what had happened there, the context in which these people lived. The school eventually closes as Bantu education is plunged into crisis from which it barely recovers, or never recovers, I should say. The school closes in 1981, and gradually the physical remnants of the students' time on campus begins to suffer as well. These are just some images of what Delaney looks like today. Because it is such an unknown story, a tremendous amount of the material culture and visual cultural history of South Africa is lost because no one has paid any attention to this site. Part of the reason they've not paid any attention to it was this once very Pacific area was a site of tremendous internecine violence during the 1980s, as different groups within Natal were angling to figure out what their position would be in the political dispensation that was then unfolding and that would result in the advent of democracy. And as political violence increased in the hinterlands of Richmond, people moved by the thousands to the relative safety of the town. So the whole area around Delaney became essentially a squatter camp. And as people moved in, what did they need? They needed to scrounge themselves. They needed materials. So they began to knock down and build abandoned buildings. Whether there was a mural on the wall was incidental. What mattered was that there were bricks and there were pipes and they could build with them. Gradually, you begin to see a sense of decay that kind of falls over the entirety of the campus, which has some unexpected benefits. as buildings fall apart, you begin to see that there had been previous levels of art that had been covered up by subsequent works, and some of these are brought to light, but much more stuff is lost. The one exception is that part of the campus becomes a provincial school for the deaf. And so as part of the project, I spent a lot of time with a sign language translator with these students, spending time on the campus and looking at the art that's still there. And a lot of it is very pristinely preserved because that beeswax method really did preserve these murals in the interior of the hall. And there's numerous sculptures that still exist as well. But the greatest tragedy, perhaps, of the whole story is that when I talked to these students and I asked them who had made this art, where did it come from, their guess was white people. Because the only people they'd ever seen painted on walls had been Methodists from Peter Maritzburg who'd come on a charity job and painted a wall with lots of pictures of Disney princesses and things of that nature. On the wall, one of the School for the Deaf hostels. They had no idea that this was part of their own history, that this was part of the social history of Black South Africa. I know I've lost total track of time but I'm almost done. Okay, so I'm just going to kind of finish on a couple notes. What is so striking about this, and what I want to propose about it, is that in Delaney offers us insights into normative behaviors and what could be achieved by normal people under circumstances that were not of their choosing, but who did what they could by scrounging, by figuring out how they could best take advantage of what opportunities there were for them. But one of my major interests still remains those people who saw the conditions and decided, hell no, I'm not going to participate in this. Those people were exceptional. Most people, I think, are like Delaney students. But now with Delaney established as a baseline, I think that we can better understand what motivated those exceptional individuals who try something entirely new. I want to return, in a sense, to heroic narratives of artists, of activists, because those heroes we can understand a bit better if we don't take them as normal historical subjects, but instead if we take them as exceptional historical subjects. And one of the best things about Delaney is it gives me some examples of those sorts of characters. And I'll just end by sketching one of them because he has such an amazing career. One of its first students at Delaney was a man named Selby Mvusi, who was a very talented artist who went to this art school because it was at that time, as it remained throughout the years of its existence, the only art school for Black South Africans in the entirety of the country. And he went and he studied and he learned how to teach in the Bantu Education system. And he went out and he taught high school art for a couple of years in Durban. And then he said, nah, this is not going to work for me. And he was fortunate. He had networks, especially through Jack Krauser, who secured for him a scholarship to leave South Africa. And he leaves in 1957. And other than briefly coming back for 3 days to pick up his kids in 1960, he never returns to the country. Instead, he pursues this amazing trajectory where he tries to outrun apartheid, he tries to outrun South Africa, and he tries to outrun, in particular, race. Because he tries to get past this idea, then pervasive, that he had seen in South Africa, made extremely manifest, that black art is only this one thing. Selby Mvusi tried in his life to prove that it could be anything. That Africans and people of African descent could do anything, no matter what the prescription of either racialists, segregationists, or also race nationalists. He was in very close dialogue and contestation with negritude theorists during this time period. And Mvusi goes all over the place, and he ends up in the University of Nairobi, where in 1965 he founds the continent's first program in industrial design. Now, it's not only the continent's first program in industrial design, but it's also outside of Northern Europe and the United States, the first program of industrial design anywhere in what we today call the Global South. Mvusi is amazed by the possibilities of computers. He's amazed by the possibilities of using complex mathematics to create structures that no one has ever imagined before. This is going to be how he short-circuits the logics of race. This is going to be how he ensures that future generations of Africans are not going to be reduced to their origins, as were his people in South Africa, by the dictates of white supremacy. He works there, he trains people, he's got all sorts of crazy ideas, and tragically he dies in a car crash in 1967 outside of Nairobi, just at the age of 38. But in his life, I think we can see someone who saw the situation, and figured out that the game was not the game. I mean, the way I always explain it, and which makes me seem old, is like in The Matrix, right? Some of you are old enough to have seen The Matrix. Increasingly, undergrads are like, what? Which is fine. But in The Matrix, right, you have to take the pill that either lets you keep living, not knowing what's happening, or you can choose to see what's really going on. Most people take the pill that lets you keep living. But Mvusi took the pill that let him see what was really going on. And he suffered a life of exile and untimely death because of it. But I think that he casts into sharp relief the ways in which beauty is always historically configured, the ways in which beauty is always made in context. And it's that example, I think, that is so powerful. I have overstayed my welcome. Thank you for your attention. The lights are, I don't remember where the lights are. I don't think they're over there. Oh. Does anyone have any questions before we try and make it brighter? Yeah.
I have a question. Thank you so much. This was a wonderful talk. I was wondering about the kind of students that attended the school. So you spoke about Bantu Education, but one of its missions was to also enforce an ethnic differentiation, right? Rather than a blackness or Africanness, as right, to enforce that divide and conquer. So I'm wondering, was there any way in which through the artwork or the teachings this ethnic differentiation was instilled? Because, so were the students all predominantly Amazulu?
No.
Supposing, or
No.
did they come from all over the country?
This, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
And then I saw a lot of men. I was wondering if there were female artists also who stood out. Or...
So these are the sources of students, all those dots. So the vast majority were not from KwaZulu or Natal. The vast majority were from Johannesburg, actually. About 50% came from the Joburg-Pretoria metroplex, which is where 50% of the population lives, so it made sense. But it was dispersed across the entire country. So the first question about ethnic differentiation within it. So like many things, the apartheid government had this idea that we are going to not only enforce racial segregation, but as you say, ethnic segregation. But they didn't really have the means to do that. So the only place they really succeeded in doing that was in patterns of residence. You would have to complete surveys that would figure out where you were supposed to live ethnically, and you would be assigned to that. So people would be removed from their homes, and their populations disaggregated based on their ethnicity, which was tremendously, I mean, people suffered tremendously as being removed very far away to fit the fiction of these pure ethnic designations. But in point of fact, you couldn't actually do that in teaching, because there simply just wasn't the resources and the knowledge to either come up with policies for it or to enforce it. So what tended to be was that black ethnic identity was collapsed into this sort of generalized concept of what Africans did, which is why you had people forced to weave grass, even though they lived in areas where there was no such grass to weave. Because the syllabus said Africans weave grass, and they were like, we're not a grass weaving people. But that doesn't matter, that was African. So the government kind of collapsed those distinctions. The gender question, yeah, I mean, I tried to highlight some women in the story, but it was actually really gender diverse. There were years when women were the majority of the class, and most years it was about 50-50. The notable thing about that is that women, those who become relatively well-known artists from Delaney, very few women make that because of what I said earlier, which is what sells is wood sculpture. And wood sculpture, the particular kind of wood they had there was this very hard, very dense wood that was incredibly difficult to work, and it tended to favor stronger people who could work it. And so men become the best known artists because especially big men who have big arms and can do it. But it is oftentimes there was a consciousness that the school had to be representative of the entire country and it had to be gender balanced.
Questions? All right. Sure? Yeah. All right. Thanks, Dan, for this fantastic talk. Wide breadth and depth is incredible. Fantastic, apart from the fact that you've ruined my primary school education.
Yeah, I know. Sorry.
Because now I think about all the hard work.
Right.
That's all the legwork
Right.
that we did back in the days, you know.
Yeah.
And I'm not that old, but in Nigeria, back in the day, primary schools, they made us do and those brooms that you
Yeah.
threw actually looked like what we created. What
Yeah.
we created. And it didn't occur to me at the time that there was anything to it. Now I think, wow, you know, Nigeria was a British colony. So obviously, maybe it traveled.
No, it did. I mean, it 100% traveled. There were commissions that traveled across the Anglophone colonies. But the really interesting thing about it, and this is another sort of element that apartheid has kind of complicated, in this sense, a lot of post-colonial governments find common cause with apartheid, although they would never say it, in this idea that we want to make sure that our people hold on to their cultural distinctiveness. We don't want to just become copies of European supposed, European universalism as Europeans style themselves. So there's a real emphasis across post-colonial Africa in handcrafts, because this is going to be a way that our nations can be founded in a way different, that's not beholden to the European colonial roots. The irony is that the idea that handcrafts is what you do in school itself was part of the process of colonialism. So anyway, but I preempted your question. So
that's for me. My question actually has to do with how you are framing it, how you frame the project. So the story of creativity, the story of innovation and resourcefulness. Is this resourcefulness and this creativity, are you framing it as an unintended consequence of Bantu education, or are you framing it as a story of agency, or both? That's the question.
Well, I mean, agency is always conditioned, right? So I'm framing it as, I don't think it was people saying, oh, Bantu education, therefore today I go find some garbage to work with. I don't think it was that instrumentalized. I think people this was the world they lived in. And so what allowed them, and I love that quote when the guy says, you take the world as your own invention. Of course that's not true. But we all think it's true because it's very hard for us to discern the structures that limit our invention. And I think that is what agency is. Agency is creativity within limits. And that's what they were doing. And it's true in politics, it's true in so many different dimensions, which is why I thought it was a revealing case study.
Okay, thank you so much for this talk. It's so rich, and there's so much. I have lots of questions. I'll just try to keep them brief. So first, just to piggyback on the gender question, I wonder to what extent these spaces were places in which people could actually reconfigure their own norms.
Yeah.
So that's one, because people are already carving out space for making other kinds of possibilities. So that's one. Second question is very small, which is just, were these artists at times keeping, I don't know what the records say to you about this, about whether they were sometimes keeping their creations and having special attachments to them, what were they able to keep with them, what were they not, because there were different kinds of attachments, and then there was also this economy that were beginning to sell, so I just wondered about that a little bit. The third question is, and I'm still trying, so it's also a little bit about the framing in a different kind of way. So as you're talking about, the language you were talking about, or that you were drawing on, is around, I think you said sort of handwork and craft work, useful arts, industrial arts. And so historians of technology have done a lot of work on tracing out how craft work and industrial arts can be separated from technology. But at many points they were the same. And so I'm wondering about how you're understanding kind of the difference between technical skills and craft art, and how your historical actors are framing that as well. And whether, and to get to the framing question, like whether this is, I mean, this could be cast as a story of ingenuity or innovation, or, I mean, there's many, so, and earlier today I asked you, like, so do you consider yourself an intellectual historian? And you're like, yeah, I don't know exactly what that even means these days. So I wonder where this fits into how you understand the broader intellectual history versus another kind of history.
So, to kind of, I'm sorry, I'm tired of looking at this map. To kind of look at the sort of gender question first. Yeah, I mean, there are some real obvious ways in which, in particular for women, I've interviewed a number of women who talked about it. So the discipline at this place, I mean, it's very rich, but in Delaney was an art school, and then it was a regular training college. So the way the thing worked is if you wanted to be a teacher, you would go to a training college for 2 years to study education. And then if you want to be a specialist teacher, you would go for an additional year to specialize in something. So in Delaney was both a normal training college, then it was a specialist arts school. But everyone lived together. And the discipline was incredibly strict, especially for women. It was still run by the matrons from the mission. And so there was incredible sexual policing that went on. And for women in particular, that put them at a disadvantage because where the studios were on the male side of campus. So men could just easily access the studios, whereas women had to be checked into their beds at night and all sorts of things. So you have certain examples of women rebelling in ways, and of Pearson, who was a very conservative person in many ways, allowing spaces for women to rebel. And I had some really interesting conversations with people about what it did to their bodies, like what it did to their nails, what it did to their hair, what it did to their clothes to be created, and how the students would look down on them because of how ugly they became, in their words. But so there was a lot of that. More interestingly, and I have much less data for this, but I think it's true, there's a lot of suicide in this story. My guess is a lot of people were closeted. In South Africa, there's not a huge literature on the closet in Black South African history, but my guess is that a lot of the people who were attracted here, there were many unmarried men in their 30s, and there just aren't that many South African men who are unmarried in their 30s. There were a lot of people there's a lot of photographs you have of people, and you can see the care with which there's just a lot of stuff going on. And the preponderance of suicide suggests to me that it's not a good, easy place to be non-gender conforming, South Africa in the 19s, throughout this period. So I think there was a lot of that. Pearson herself never married. She was probably gay, I would think, but she never talked about that. But she never married, which was also very uncommon for someone of her class and social position. So there's a lot there. I mean, I think the fact that it was so removed was the attraction for a lot of people. To the question of, I kind of forget your other. Oh yeah, so there's beautiful stories. The last thing I talk about in the book is one that still makes me cry when I think about it, which is a guy who just writes a letter. He's been gone for 10 years, and he's like, I just finished a sculpture, and I'm never going to sell it. And its name in Zulu translates to I'm grateful for life. And it's such a beautiful sentiment. And he said he was a teacher. He said I would work until the sun went down outside of the school every night for a month, and I made this thing, and I'm never going to sell it. And it's just such a powerful thing. And there's a lot of that, people talking, especially one of my favorite students was a nun who was horrible. She was a terrible artist. But she created she never sold anything. And so her nunnery bought them all and brought them back she went back to the convent with them and hung them on her walls and just wrote about how happy it made her just to look at them. But to the sort of bigger question, which I also don't remember, but I remember it was big.
Just about how the lines between.
Oh yeah. So right. So that's one of the most interesting problems. So Jack Krauser is this really interesting guy, the guy who did the brooms and this drawing. He's really interesting because this drawing is taken from a book called The Art of Africa, which he and a bunch of other South Africans edited in 1958. And the really notable thing about it is that if you look at what was then the nascent field of African art history, South Africa does not figure in that. South Africa really doesn't have that many indigenous art traditions that can be identified, can be just sort of taken out of context and said this is art, unlike Auditorium in West Africa, and to some extent Makonde art in Mozambique. But Krauser and these guys are trying to make the case for South African art without saying so. And so 2/3 of the book is about South African craft traditions. And they're making an argument that craft is art. And they're making an argument, which is also an argument that Dewey had made. It's an argument that a lot of people who've been very critical of the heroic narrative of the artist had been making, going back to the arts and crafts movement in the 19th century, Ruskin and all these other people in the UK, who were saying, no, art is not just elite artists working in oil paints, but art is the everyday creating that people do, even when you set a table. that's an art. And so that kind of democratization of art was very much what they were trying to do. And so they were trying to make this argument that art can be, that all design, anything that's designed, be it a book, be it a curriculum, be it a village, be it a broom, is a form of art, and therefore can participate in all these narratives about art's importance in social harmony. Mbusi is really interested in this regard, the guy on whom I ended, because he, even though he's incredibly critical of Krauser and very critical of the racialist background of his art education, he holds on to the idea that this idea of design as being a bigger category than art, and that anything that people make, he calls design the plastic realization of time consciousness, which for him means essentially whatever people make at a particular moment is design. And that includes visual art, that includes an urban plan. He's really interested in urban planning in post-colonial Africa. It includes anything, so he wants to collapse that distinction between industry and art, between craft and art. So he thinks of industrial design as being the outcome of that collapsed distinction, not as a sort of corollary to it, but actually the outcome of this way in which all art is design, whether industrial or fine arts.
Well, thank you so much.
Okay, sure.